Okay. Okay, so a very good evening, and we are so happy to have all of you come yet again after a gap of a week, and listen to Allan Gluck. Now, who is Allan? Where is Allan? All about that. Allan is a very dear friend of mine. We are currently in Los Angeles. He has an MA degree in biology from the University of South Florida and was in the doctorate program at UCLA, specializing in seaweed biology. Now, we didn't know that biology will be that myopic, that they would be like looking at seaweeds as well. Some seaweeds are really yummy, the Japanese ones. But anyway, so he did not complete his degree, but instead got into the business world as a real estate appraiser, which he has been for 30 years, and now he's retired. As an appraiser, he was the chief appraiser at several banks before opening his own practice, which he had for 20 years, specializing in the appraisal of commercial and industrial properties and land. In December 2011, there was a change. And the change was that he and his family visited Egypt for a month. That's where I met him during my excavations. I was a grad student. Allan, I believe that's the time I met you. He was visiting during the parliamentary elections after Mubarak's departure, Hosni Mubarak's departure, where he absolutely fell in love with the Egyptian people and Egyptology. Egyptology and photography became his passion since then. He was a tour guide with his son for many years at the Franklin Canyon site of the Santa Monica National Recreation areas, giving tours on the historical importance of this place. For 5 years, he was a docent at the Robert and Frances Fullerton Museum of Art on the campus of California State University, San Bernardino, which has the largest publicly available display of Egyptian artifacts in Southern California. Allan, as I said, is now retired. And for the last 3 years, he's been a docent at the villa at the J. Paul Getty Museum, which is the only museum in the United States solely associated with the display of Greek and Roman antiquities, giving tours to school groups. It is important to recognize that he is here benefiting from the experience of the Getty, but is here in a very informal kind of positioning where he's expressing his own opinion. So his opinions are his own, like everybody else. And he's not a representative in terms of the opinions of the Getty Museum. So today he will be talking to us about various artifacts and how he sees the role of museums and the contribution of docents in these museums. I won't describe the presentation itself, but I feel it's very important to understand the museum space because, you know, as archaeologists, we dig out all these objects, and we've had a change, you know, right from the Renaissance till now, that how from objects of curiosity of the world that had never seen them, now they have context, they're labeled, but they also speak of a certain interpretation that is given by the person who's curating them. What do we make of it? Do we get connected to these objects? What is the right way to view the space, to navigate the space? There's so many questions, you know, how do you deal with things that are religious? How do you treat them in the museum? There's so many kind of debates in the museum setup. So I'm really, really grateful that Allan can be here early morning, Los Angeles time. And I love his backdrop. It's like he's sitting as the Maharaja in a beautiful pillared kind of hall, enlightening us all about the halls of the Getty Museum and his own experience of having been a docent at various places. So over to you, Allan. Take us to the world of museums.
Hello, everybody.
And just a minute before you start, if everybody could have their videos and their mics off, that would be wonderful.
Well, hello, everybody. I know for you, it's good evening. As Sonali mentioned, it's 7 a.m. here in Los Angeles. So good morning to those of you that are on this side of the globe. I actually didn't know that 7 a.m. existed on Sunday mornings. So this is a new experience for me. I wanted to thank Sonali for, and to you, to thank all of you for being here, for the great pleasure of sharing this with you. Sonali, in the introduction, introduced me and my background. I'm actually quite curious about you folks. Sonali has told me that you're quite a diverse group, and I was just hoping that maybe in the chat, you'd be good enough to let me know where you're at or where you're from, and maybe in one word, describe how you see yourself. Are you a student? Are you a teacher? Are you a hobbyist? That would really help me, and I'd like to get to know you, and I'd appreciate that. Sonali asked me to join you to talk about museums and the role of docents in museums. As Sonali pointed out, I've been a docent for many, many years, and she thought that this would be an interesting topic for us to discuss. As we go through this, please feel free to shout out any questions or comments that you have. Unfortunately, if you raise your hand, I probably won't see it. So feel free to just shout it out, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have, and would appreciate any comments that you have. Maybe Sonali could help me, and if somebody does raise their hand, maybe Sonali could monitor that and let me know.
So Allan, we
that would be
usually
cool.
do that end of the session. So we open the forum for questions, and I take them in the order we receive the questions. So you will get to interact with them for sure.
Okay, fantastic. Okay. So Sonali asked me to talk about museums and the role of docents in museums. Okay, and so it would seem logical that this topic, oh wait, I need to share my screen. Okay, here we go. Let's see, with you, okay. Share screen, okay. So let's, beginning. Okay, there we go. Okay, so this is, and by the way, on this screen is my email address. So if you ever have any comments or follow-up issues, please feel free to email me. Sonali asked me to talk about the role of docents in museums. So it would seem logical to start this discussion with first asking the question of what is the role of museums? And to do that, I turned to the definition of a museum that was created by an organization called ICOM. It's a very well-recognized organization, the International Council of Museums. ICOM is a Paris-based organization that has about 40,000 members and is in 120 different countries. In 2007, they adopted this definition of what a museum is. Okay, a museum is a nonprofit permanent institution in the service of society and its development, open to the public, which acquires, conserves, researches, communicates, and exhibits the tangible and intangible heritage of humanity and its environment for the purposes of education, study, and enjoyment. Okay, it's a little bit of a mouthful, but something that I think most people can get their arms around and feel comfortable with. Well, since 2007, of course, society has changed, and we've become increasingly sensitive to status and the role that status has in institutions. And so in 2016, frozen. Okay, ICOM created a committee to establish a new definition. Okay, And they solicited input from their membership and received 269 responses, 269 different definitions of what a museum is. And I would urge all of you to go to ICOM's website and read these definitions. They are both enlightening and entertaining. The committee that was in charge selected 5 of these definitions to present to the board for their consideration, and the board selected 1. And this is the definition that they selected. Museums are democratizing, inclusive, and polyphonic spaces for critical dialogue about the past and the futures. Acknowledging and addressing the conflicts and challenges of the present, they hold artifacts and specimens in trust for society, safeguard diverse memories for future generations, and guarantee equal rights and equal access to heritage for all people. Museums are not for profit. They are participatory, transparent, and work in active partnership with and for diverse communities to collect, preserve, research, interpret, exhibit, and enhance understandings of the world, aiming to contribute to human dignity and social justice, global equality, and planetary well-being. Well, I suspect that as you look at this, you can see that it's quite difficult to get your arms around all of this, and to say that it was a controversial definition would be an understatement. 9 of the board members, the president of ICOM, and even the head of the committee resigned. In the face of this, they reconstituted the committee, but that was a failed effort. The head of the committee resigned again, and all of this made for great headlines in many of the publications. As it stands, the ICOM retains its 2007 definition, and their plans are to introduce a new definition in September, in their meeting of September 2022 in Prague. So that's where it stands in terms of trying to define what a museum is. Certainly not an easy task. And I can imagine that all of you have been into museums. Maybe you are like myself and kind of a museum addict and been to many, many museums. And you know, I think what we would all conclude is that each museum stands alone. They define themselves differently. They have their own mission. They have their own way of doing things. So they don't fit into a single definition. And so with that said, I think it's equally instructive to point out then that the role of a docent is also ambiguous and is defined differently with each institution. Now, I know some of you, I've used the word docent several times here, and it's not a word that many people are comfortable with. They are not familiar with it. Generally, what a docent is a unpaid, non-paid volunteer that gives tours. Now, this is somewhat different from an unpaid, non-paid volunteer where their tasks are to greet you at the institution, maybe hand out brochures, or to guide guests to places that of interest to them. The third category that a person might encounter at a museum, of course, is the paid professional staff And they are generally termed staff or guides. Now, here in the United States, if you are at a museum and you are on a tour, it is impossible to know the status of the tour guide without asking, even from the badge, because these terms are so ambiguous. But for purposes of this discussion, the docent is defined as really someone that it's not paid and gives tours. So here we have this ambiguous situation as we try to define what is the museum and the role of a docent in that museum. What I'll be speaking to here are what I think are the best practices today, kind of the state of the art. This is, in my mind, best characterized by two books by an individual named Elliot Kai Key. Dr. Kai Key wrote a book in 2011 called Teaching in the Art Museum, Interpretation as Experience. And this book is used nationwide in many of the training programs for museum staff. Last year, he came out with another book expanding upon his ideas called Activity-Based Teaching in the Art Museum, Movement, Embodiment, and Emotion. In Eliot's first book, now we should understand that the first museums were created for the display of objects collected by private individuals and heads of state. As the scientific method came to fruition, the objects in these museums became an increasing subject of research, such that they became organized and studied for their historical value and the subject of intellectual endeavors. Of late, their mission has expanded to include education of the public and the role they play in cultural discourse. And as such, the role of museums and those that give tours in museums have evolved. When I grew up, okay, in the classroom and both in the classroom and in giving tours, the typical methodology was for the head of the session to give a lecture, kind of a fire hose presentation of facts and figures with question and answers at the end. That notion has fallen by the wayside. In Eliot's first book, what he does is he encourages tour guides and docents to undertake a process of interpretation. And the idea here is that the role of the docent is to encourage the connection of the visitor to the object. And the docent does this through inquiry, through asking the visitors to engage in the subject and to express how they feel about the objects. In Eliot's, in the book that Eliot came out with last year in 2020, he expanded upon this idea so that the role of the docent was then to incorporate activities in the tour where people then engage all of their senses. For instance, the docent would then incorporate in the tour activities that would involve motion in a process that he calls embodiment. And I think the best way to come to understand this process is by example. And I will be using examples from the J. Paul Getty Museum. The first example here is this amazing bronze statue of an eagle. It's a Roman statue that is about 3 feet tall. So typically what would happen, or frequently what would happen, would be that a docent would bring the group to this object and then ask them what they think about it to get the first notions of what the visitors would sense. The docent then might ask the visitors to stand like this eagle and to see what it's like, to ask how they feel about what they are sensing. The docent might then ask the visitors to extend their hand out and pretend like they are touching the eagle. Of course, visitors are not allowed to touch these objects, but to at least to try to envision what it would feel like to touch it. And then that way, try to engage the sense of touch. The docent then might ask the visitors to think about where they have encountered eagles, both live eagles and the eagle as a symbol, in order to encourage the visitors to connect with the object in their own life. And so by this method of inquiry, the docent is encouraging the visitors to connect with this object through a variety of senses, through movement, touch, as well as emotion. Okay, another example is here. Okay, this is a bed that's located at the Getty Center. It was created in the 1700s. Okay, when a docent would bring a group to see this object, the docent might first ask the visitors to pretend like they're lying in this bed. What would the bed feel like? How do they feel about being in the bed? The docent might ask the visitors then to envision what kind of room this bed would be in, and to create a picture of that room in their mind. What would they be seeing? What would they be hearing? What kind of people would be in this room? And in that way, the visitor would be connecting with this object, sensing what it would be like to be with this object. Okay. Here is another object, okay, that is very popular at the J. Paul Getty Villa. Okay, this is a marble sculpture that is about 1 foot tall. Okay, when looking at this object, the docent might ask the visitors just the open-ended question: what do they think about it? What do they find most striking? This would undoubtedly result in a very wide range of responses. And one of them would undoubtedly be that this sculpture is nude. So then the docent might ask why the visitors think that this sculpture is nude. And then point out that the way that the ancient Greeks thought about nudity was different from the way we think about it today. The docent would point out that the Greeks thought of the human body as a sign of perfection and strength. And so typically these, when you see a nude statue, it is of somebody that is in a powerful position. And in fact, the nude statues are limited to 3 categories: those that are gods, heroes, or athletes. So we know just by looking at this statue that it is a statue of someone of status. The docent would then point out that we know that this is a statue of Alexander the Great because of the way the hair is arranged. There's a lock of hair that is characteristic of Alexander the Great. So this is depicting him with his strength. Now, at this point, there's a point of departure. I would also say that one of the areas of controversy is that some docents feel that that what is appropriate is to only use things that are within the museum in their tours. So they would point the visitors to the wall panels, to the narrative portion of the labels, and to the portion of the labels that describe the individual objects, and encourage visitors to utilize all of these to come to understand the objects. I take a point of view that's a little bit different in that I sometimes introduce things that I carry with me. And in looking at this object, what I would do is I would show them this picture and point out that while that sculpture now has no color, originally the Greek sculptures were painted. Okay, now when they look at this, they typically are quite amazed. And then they would ask, how do we know that they were painted? Well, as it turns out, as most of you know, there are flecks of paint that remain within the crevices of the sculpture. And through scientific study, microscopic study, it's possible to identify the colors that are used. And so what is depicted here is the result of that study. It is thought that these represent what these objects originally looked like. And then, from there, it's easy to begin a discussion of what they think about these colors. And I think that, with each individual, how they feel about it differs, as well as the different cultures respond to these colors differently. With this object, I would also ask, as a docent, I would ask them to cup their hands and to look through their fingers at the face, and then to remember that face. And then look around the gallery where they would see that that bust is very common among the other sculptures. And then I would ask them, what about the arms? Do they see the arms? Of course, the arms are not there. Well, what is in their place? Okay, and they would obviously see that there are no arms and that there are holes. So that becomes a point of discussion. Why are there holes? Well, this leads to a discussion of the fact that many of these sculptures were actually created through the assemblage of parts. So the arms were actually sculpted separately and then attached to this sculpture using those holes. And the same thing might have occurred with the bust. And what we think may have occurred is that there were workshops that specialized in these individual parts. And so when somebody wanted to create a sculpture, they would go to these individual workshops and they would pick out the arms or the bust that they would want and put it together, kind of like a Lego set. So there are things that we can learn about these sculptures through our own observation. These are pictures of two reliefs. The one in the upper left is in the permanent collection of the J. Paul Getty Museum, and it's on display at the Getty Villa. The one on the right was in a temporary exhibit at the J. Paul Getty Museum. Both of these are from the same place. And as you can tell, they create quite a bit of emotion as you look at them. So one of the questions that the docent might ask is where you think these sculptures come from. And certainly the one from the right, very common response is it comes from India. Well, as it turns out, that is not correct. Both these sculptures come from a place called Palmyra. And Palmyra is an ancient city that today is in the center of Syria, in Mesopotamia, what was Mesopotamia. And Palmyra was important because it was a way station on the route of the Silk Road. So it was truly a multicultural city that was at the intersection of the cultures to the east, including India and China, as well as the cultures to the west, that of the Mesopotamian region and even Egypt. So, and this sculpture reflects that. Okay, it obviously has traits that are characteristic of the Indian culture. Okay, but it turns out the hairdo is of Roman style, and the jewelry is the style of Persia, Iran. And so embodied in this sculpture are three different cultures. And so I use this sculpture to demonstrate that these ancient cultures were multicultural. Okay, they weren't monolithic. And with that, it leads to a natural discussion about the similarities then of that culture with the cities that many of us live in, which are likewise multicultural. That certainly is true in Los Angeles and the United States, where we are a nation of immigrants. And so these sculptures are similar, show a similarity of these ancient cultures to the societies that we have today, their multicultural nature. What's also interesting about this sculpture is to think about them in the way that was mentioned with the Greek sculpture, that originally they were painted. So the issue is to ask the visitors to think of what they might, how they might conceptualize this if it was painted. And in fact, this reconstruction was done in 2019 to show what this sculpture, this relief would have looked like. And we can use this also as the example of multiculturalism. The headdress has traces of madder lake, a vegetable red dye, whose earliest use is recorded in India in the 3rd millennium BC. The blue color is indigo, one of the most expensive pigments and found in Egypt and Afghanistan. And the red pigment on the tunic is cinnabar, which came from Spain and China. There are traces of red ochre, which came from Turkey and Egypt. And the yellow pigment is from France. So we can use these pigments again to demonstrate the multicultural nature of society some 2,000 years ago. One of my favorite objects is this one. When taking visitors to this object, it kind of speaks for themselves. Typically, it's visitors, when they first see this, are quite animated. And with that, a fun thing to do is to ask that they imagine that they owned these. Would they like owning them? Would they wear them? Would they like getting them as a gift? Okay, and in this way, to again try to make this a personal experience. This is in a display case that you see in the upper right, with other objects that are from Alexandria in Egypt, and which also show a multicultural influence. The docent would then ask if they can identify any of the iconography on this. And certainly they would point out the objects on the bottom. And these are actually an early Greek character known as Erotus, which was the early Cupid. So we have Greek iconography. It's hard to see on this, but the little objects on the top are bulls. And those are characteristic of Egyptian society. And obviously, these are made of gold. And there were gold mines in Egypt at the time, but much of the gold from Egypt came from the area to the south known as Nubia. And within this, you can see right above the sphere is a pearl. Okay, and these pearls are quite rare in ancient objects, and they came from either India or Persia. So again, with this object, we can see the multicultural nature of Alexandria in Egypt, with Egypt then a multicultural society. One offshoot of this is to ask the docents to imagine that they were then in Alexandria at the time. What kind of foods would they see on the street? What kind of languages would they hear? And again, that might be very much like what a person is experiencing today. That certainly would be true in Los Angeles, where we have food and languages from all over the world. One way in which I differ in my tours is that I try to pick objects that have a moral theme. And this is one of my favorite objects to demonstrate that. It's a very large sarcophagus, which was created in Rome about 1800 years ago. And what you see in the lower register is a battle scene, okay? And, the first thing to do is to ask the visitors to interpret this. And of course, they would recognize that this is indeed a battle scene, and that large figure kind of left of center has defeated and killed the individual on the ground. Okay, well, the individual, and then I would point out, yes, indeed, this is scene from the Trojan War. And the individual standing on the left is Achilles, the head of the Greeks. And he has defeated the Trojans, and the Trojans were led by an individual named Hector, who's lying on the ground and dead. But then I asked the visitors, what is Achilles doing? Has he just defeated him? And of course, part of the discussion would then point to the fact that Achilles has not just defeated him, but he's stamping on Hector. So then the docent might ask, well, how do you feel about that? Is that what you should do when you defeat someone, your opponent? You should stamp on them? Have you ever felt like that? Have you ever felt like doing that? And of course, the discussion would then lead to the notion that maybe this wasn't such a good thing for Achilles to have done. And we can see a character to the right of Achilles, and he's pointing to Achilles in an accusatory way. And that's Odysseus telling Achilles that maybe he's not doing the right thing. And in this way, we can demonstrate that this relief has told a story. It's 1,800 years old, but it's a story that's about a moral issue that even today we can connect with. And then I can use this to point out that that's why we study history, because these people experienced things similar to what we experience today, and we can learn from them. So the role of the docent has evolved. We are no longer, as docents, doing a presentation that kind of like what I just did, kind of a fire hose of facts and figures, to one where we engage the visitor to become connected with the objects. And through this close looking, we can point out that they can understand a lot about these objects through their own observation, even without a technical knowledge. Now, the practice of docents vary widely. Some emphasize the desire that the visitor connect through embodiment. Some simply have the desire that the visitors have fun. Others hope that visitors come away with some kind of piece of information. Many incorporate a drawing exercise in the tour where they would give visitors a small clipboard with a piece of paper and a pencil and ask the visitor to draw a certain section on the object. And some take this a step further and ask that they do the drawing without looking at the paper, looking just at the object. And when I first did this, I thought that was kind of insane. But I suggest that you all undertake this kind of exercise because it ends up being quite informative and certainly amusing. But it helps in close looking of these objects. The emphasis, the one unifying concept to all this is that the emphasis is on creating a connection between the visitor and the object and place based on the visitor's own life. Now, the last section of this discussion, this presentation, I would like to look at gallery and how galleries are set up and how they meet this educational mission in trying to create a connection between the objects and the visitors. Okay, and again, I will use the J. Paul Getty Museum as an example, and I think that it is representative of most of the museums that I've been to. This is a view of the gallery at the villa, which has a very fine collection of Greek and Roman glass. And this is the wall panel that exists in that room to describe, to give the visitor some idea of what they're seeing. Now, I understand that the text is too small for you to read, and in a way that's by design, because that's not the focus here. But take my word for it, what it does is it gives a general description of the history of glassmaking in Greek and Roman society. It includes a discussion of the materials and methods that were used, and something of a timeline. But one thing it doesn't do is it doesn't tie in this discussion to this display or the objects. It's just a general discussion. Here's one of the display cases that shows the objects which were created through the use of molds. So let's look at the label. Okay, this is the portion of the label that provides a narrative description, and I'll read it to you. Starts out, they call these objects cast glass. And cast glass was manufactured by pouring the hot material into a mold. After partly cooling, the glass could be shaped to refine the form and decoration. Finely modeled bowls and cups are the most common types of cast vessels. Pendants, inlays, and other small objects were also created in this manner. And then here's the description of the objects. Every object is described by 3 lines. The first line is overall description. The second lines provide where they were found in the time period, and the last, the material. So for instance, one of them is a green bowl with incised lines, Greek, 200 to 100 BC, and glass. Now, what I ask you to do is to think about that, and to think about what kind of connection the visitor has through this information. To me, none of this material, certainly all of that was said was true. Okay, unquestionably true. These are facts that provide a description of the objects and the general time period and context. But what I don't see is any notion of the meaning. Why are these facts important? It does not provide anything that helps create a connection between the object and the visitor. Now, with that said, there was an exhibit at the J. Paul Getty Museum, a temporary exhibit in 2018 that I thought was exemplary and did a wonderful job in creating this connection. It was called Beyond the Nile, Egypt and the Classical World. Now I have to apologize in advance. I took these pictures at the exhibit, but I didn't take pictures of the wall panels, but I can describe them to you as we go through this. As you enter the exhibit, in the first introductory hall was this exhibition map, which gives a floor plan to the gallery and the different rooms and describes the rooms. So you can see the method behind the madness. You can see how the rooms relate to each other. In addition, there was a wall panel that discussed, clearly defined the purpose of this exhibit. And the purpose of this exhibit was to provide an understanding of the effect of Egypt on other Mediterranean cultures and how other Mediterranean cultures affected Egypt. In other words, it focused on the multiculturalism of the Mediterranean society, with the Mediterranean Sea simply a soup. In the first room was described as Egypt and the Aegean in the Bronze Age, 2000 to 1100 BC. And there was a wall panel that discussed how Egypt was affected by cultures in the Aegean, and how cultures in the Aegean were affected by Egypt, with a display of objects that demonstrate this concept. Now, this is one of the display cases, and it talks about Egyptian objects found on Crete. And the first line of the narrative says, by the end of the 3rd millennium BC, Egyptian stone vessels were being imported into Minoan Crete, where they were highly prized as luxury items. So a comment that directly ties into the overall concept of how Egypt affected other cultures. Let's look at one of these objects, and this happens to be my favorite object in this whole exhibit. It's a jar with Minoan alterations. So this was an object that was created in Egypt during dynasties 1 through 3, 3000 to 2613 BC, and reworked on Crete about 1450 BC, and found in Kato Zagros, Crete. So this is an object that was created in Egypt, and some 1500 years later was reworked on Crete, speaking to the interaction between these two cultures. We see a similar thing in the second gallery. And in this case, it's turning the attention opposite. Okay, this was the Greeks' return to Egypt. So here's the influence of the Greeks on Egypt in Egypt. And we have this wonderful sarcophagus. So in this particular case, this is a sarcophagus that was located in Egypt. And the name of the individual that was interned in this sarcophagus was Egyptian. However, in the narrative on the sarcophagus, it states the names of the parents, and the parents are Greek. So what is thought is that this individual was the son of Greek immigrants in Egypt. So that kind of brings me to the end of this presentation. I end with this discussion of the galleries to ask the question about how the galleries fulfill this mission of education and creating connections between visitors and objects. This is something that docents are very sensitive to, and it's something that something that we need to think about in all of our museums. Over here is my email address. As mentioned, I am a docent at the J. Paul Getty Museum at the Villa. I hope that all of you will take down my email address, and when you're in Los Angeles, drop me a line, and I'd be very happy to give you a tour of the Villa. It would be my great pleasure if tours are allowed at that time. And if my sparkling personality isn't enough incentive, I can get you free parking. So with that, are there any questions or comments?
And talk about parking. Parking is a real nightmare in Los Angeles. It's very, very pricey. So I think those who are not in Los Angeles may not understand that bit, because in India we squeeze in anywhere we get a chance. So, but that's very gracious of you. And if we could have, maybe you could stop sharing the screen, Alan, so that we can start seeing everybody. Yeah. So thank you for that enlightening talk about museum and perceptions and how we see objects. And it brings to mind my own experience, at the Fowler Museum at UCLA, which was kind of, the archaeologists, our Institute of Archaeology is right below the Fowler, and there was no connection between the two. And I remember that, you talk about docents, and the Fowler would have docents coming in for some kind of curated art shows or galleries, but not always. So when I was the director of programs there, I kind of curated a place where archaeologists could work as docents in terms of giving contextuality. And those of you who are interested, they can watch there's a YouTube video on the Hicks channel where I talk about enduring splendor, about jewelry in the wonderful collection from Bikaner on gold and silver jewelry from India, of course, where I navigate the museum. And I feel it has to be very personalized as well. How do you ignite interest? Of course, the objects are there, and how to tell that story. So it's all about storytelling as well, visually, verbally, and then non-verbally, and then engaging with it verbally in some periods. And I think docents do a wonderful job doing that. So if we have any questions at this point in time, it would be wonderful if you can just throw them all to address them to Allan. So anybody has questions? I know Charukeshi is from, she has studied museology. So Charukeshi, do you have anything to add?
Hi, ma'am. So, Alan sir, I think, first of all, it's been a few years since we had a very brief introduction to museology as part of our curriculum when I was doing my master's from the National Museum. And I remember that we basically dealt with a lot of theory behind it about how a museum operates. But honestly, it's been very, very informative today because I personally felt that there was this gap, at least when I saw the museum and I saw how visitors connect with the objects in India in particular. And I saw that there was this gap when they would appreciate it, they would admire the beauty, but that's about it. And so the way you spoke to us and how you told us about all the activities and how it helps one connect to the actual object, it's been absolutely wonderful. It makes me think how we've somehow stopped connecting with art and art objects and how we've started to analyze it rationally. So one thing I kept thinking was, since I believe that you've been doing this for a long time, do you have any interesting conversations that you can think about? Because I believe you must come across people from like a variety of fields, right? So when you were having these discussions, anything that kind of stayed with you or something that left a mark?
Wow. Yeah, there are many. I mean, I think one that happened actually just before the lockdown was that one of the objects at the J. Paul Getty Museum is a mummy. And, in today's world, we have become increasingly conscious of people's sensitivities to things. And one of the docents was taking a group of sixth graders through, and there was a student, her name was Stella, and Stella raises her hand and she says, "Are you aware that this was a human being? That we're putting on display a human being? How do you feel about that?" And that's coming from a sixth grader.
That's really deep.
Yeah.
And I do want to talk about, like experiences of these little kids. They kind of throw you. I have a Michelangelo's David, like this is years ago in my house in Delhi. My father, I think he ignited my interest in museums because he would just let me and my sister go to the Vatican. He would just say, okay, you need to find these objects. And that's a very interesting way, like how parents can kind of integrate their kids to learn. So he would just say, go into the museum. I'll meet you at 5 at this spot on the way back.
Mm-hmm.
And we would be left to our devices and we would explore. And my father would give a questionnaire to us. And I would always be interested. My sister was not that keen, so I would take her guidance because I was the younger one, but I would look for the objects that my father talked about. And then at 5, I would have to report to him over dinner as to what all I saw and what did I think. And I think that's a very nice way of, getting to know the museum, engaging and interacting with your parents or your friends. And I remember this little boy coming to my home, and my father had this Michelangelo's David at home. Uh, and he got a leaf. And, you're talking about nudity. He just put the leaf on his genitals. And he said, why is he like that? Why is he naked? And we all started laughing. And I said, that's art. He says, oh, so it is art. You can be naked in art. So it was an interesting conversation. And of late, when my son visited LACMA, not now, but when he was about 4, he also said, he says, why aren't they not wearing diapers, Mama? I said, because, it spoils the alignment. They look so beautiful this way. And he was aghast, and there were so many people standing and they were laughing. So kids can really make the museum space interesting with their questions, and they come up with rather deep questions at times, which we take for granted. We don't focus on them, but they are indeed, they make us think. They have thought-provoking questions as well. So Romel has a question. Romel, over to you.
Not so much as an original question, but what was the answer to the fact to the Stella's question?
Well, it's a everyone has to come up with their own answer. Okay, one of the answers is that the purpose of creating a mummy was so that the lives of these people would live forever. And so, and that the person that's in the mummy is always remembered. And so with this person on display, it could be said that desire was realized, that we are not forgetting this person, that they are living forever. I mean, this mummy is 2,000 years old, and we're still paying respect to this individual, which was what their intent was.
And I think that's a very important point that you brought forth, Allan, because the whole idea of being remembered is a very important part of the Egyptian conception of the afterlife. They have a word, Remet, for it, that don't forget, because non-existence is worse than death. Death is not bad for the Egyptians. It's non-existence, which is a punishment. And they don't want to be anywhere near that. So this whole fixation with tomb making and coffins is because it kind of is their conception of the afterlife. And I think Allan's answer to that little girl condensed the view of the Egyptian afterlife. So, and very true. So
that was a docent's answer. That was not an Egyptian's answer. That was
that's what I'm saying, that Allan's answer condensed the Egyptian conception of life. A very complex kind of understanding of Egypt was condensed by Allan for this little girl. So that's what I'm trying to say, that it is really important to speak the language of children. Just because we are Egyptologists or Indologists doesn't mean that we can answer to the people that come our way. Sometimes, docents can navigate that route and answering very complex questions in such a simplistic fashion.
Yeah, I have to add also, Rommel, that I don't know that we'd have an answer, a good answer. I can assure you what happened was that this conversation was actually brought into a meeting of the docents, and we had a very animated discussion about it. And maybe it's not the right thing to do. I know that today there are museums that will not display mummies because of this issue.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. What do you think?
I don't know. I have no idea, but it is quite fascinating to wonder what the ancient Egyptians who actually built these big pyramids and entombed the body so securely, would have wondered about a public display of these bodies.
Well, they wouldn't have
Well,
liked it. They were never meant to be displayed. They were always meant to be hidden, and they took pains to hide them. And I
So
speak
what
as
would
an
they?
Egyptologist, so
Yeah. So the question is, we today are doing exactly the opposite, and that seems to be. I don't know. I mean, some may think that is disrespectful to the idea of what the ancient Egyptians wanted to do.
if I may add, Allan, it is for the quest of understanding the past, of understanding the roots, it's important to discern it. And I would say that if you're finding a whole cemetery of coffins, don't dig up the entire cemetery, but dig up a sample, a random sample or whatever way. And there are ways of doing that, because archaeologists do that. They do random sampling, they do a pattern sampling, because it is as important to know our past to understand where we come from, our identity, and understand so many other factors, how society was, the religion, how they interacted, because that what makes each of our where we come from unique. It's important to tap onto the history as well. And this debate will be ongoing, especially with the Native Americans, for example, when the bodies, for example, the Kennesaw man was excavated. People, the Native Americans were very, very hurt. It was a very sensitive topic, and how this has been navigated. One should read articles on that, because it's really interesting how you counter that. How do you counter customary law and their religious perceptions about a certain thing, about their things in the afterlife. So I feel that, of course, you don't do it in a way that hurts the sentiments, but also there's a break. So I think we are not as kind of connected to the Egyptian world as we would be to the Native Americans who still exist. But in the interest of history and science and the spirit of quest, it is important to take out a little bit of the past, display it so that people know about what it was. We know so much about Egyptian mummies and what they did, what King Tut died of, what problems, what inbreeding kind of problems they had, and what is reflected in their mummies. There's so many questions that can be answered, but we have to be very judicious in our approach, would be my answer. So, and select.
We have been in, I think the modern ages, we've been very iconoclastic, but nothing is sacred anymore to us, right? I don't know much about the Egyptians. If the mummies were sacred to them, if the ancient kings were sacred to them, then we are desecrating the sacredness of it. But we have not been dealt any punishment by the gods for it, right?
The thing is, Romel, I don't know if you know that. I think it was earlier this year, Allan, when the parade of the pharaohs happened, when all the mummies were transported to the Grand Egyptian Museum. And I think especially archaeologists and museum curators do take care of not desecrating, but giving it value and giving it an identity. And I think that permeates, especially in the Egyptian context, because I've had these conversations with people and they talk about this whole idea of not being forgotten. I think giving a name to a mummy and finding who that person is, what was his life or her life like, I think that is also important. Again, I said, not just like tearing apart the whole place, but giving them respect. I know of Egyptian pharaohs who have been brought from other countries which have taken them away and given them the respect, coming back to Egypt, giving them literally a red carpet welcome. So it's about intentionality as well. The intentionality is not to desecrate, but know, the knowing. So, and the knowing for a purpose, which is about getting connected to the past. Allan, do you have anything to say there?
Yeah, I want to actually respond to Rommel in that, I think what you're getting at too is that though there may be reasons why this practice may be appropriate, I think what you're getting at is that in being honest about why this is on display, is that it's because of just simply human interest. And, that is in a way desecration of the intent. The reason that I gave is true, but that's really not the intent. And, if we want to be honest, we should talk about that intent. And that struck me actually an exhibit at the California Science Center where they had mummies on display. And they had the mummies on display, but along with many other objects. And they allowed the visitor to take pictures of the other objects, but not the mummies. And the reason that they gave was that they felt that taking pictures was disrespectful. Well, I don't know. I felt that was kind of hypocritical, because if it was disrespectful to take pictures, it's also disrespectful to put them on display, and certainly disrespectful to charge $20 to get in to see them. So I think we need to be honest about this too in this discussion. So you bring up a good point, Rommel.
And also, the history, Rommel, of these mummies, a lot of them were taken by the Westerners and put in, weird circus shows. A lot of these mummies were found in these spaces. There's one episode of a mummy being found by a person in some circus in Niagara, like much earlier. And that was transported. He realized that it's a mummy because of the stance of the pharaoh, buried like that in the 18th dynasty. And he bought that mummy and then let it go through CT scan and all, and realized it's actually a pharaoh. And then they transported that mummy to Egypt. And that's one of the mummies that's housed in the museum. So I think there are different strands to this argument. So if you look at this mummy, that it has been kind of given respect by taking it away from that circus kind of space where people are looking at the weird and the odd, or so many mummies were kind of ground for, better health and removed from that space and got to the museum where at least they are not desecrated in that form. So maybe they are being like in another way, like a level down, but it also gives a sense of history and identity, how to make sure to respect them, to preserve them, because it's important that they are just not dead bodies, they have meaning, and bringing forth that meaning, because if they were not to study all of this, and they were not told about all of this, who would know the story behind them? that also becomes important.
Mhm.
So with display, I feel I totally agree with what Allan said. Like, I remember going to the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, and they charge an amount to enter the mummy display part. But the thing is that they need that money to keep temperatures and all of that, the room climate control in that area. And many Egyptologists want to study that. So it's like a situation which we have to kind of, like Allan said, debate and talk about how we really feel. When somebody dies in the, in religions like Christianity, they're also displayed before their death. Sometimes if there's a murder investigation, you get the body out in the spirit of inquiry, what happened. It's important to know, what happened. Is that desecration as well? There's so many instances that we can talk about and debate about, but I think Romel has raised a very interesting point, which does you question it, because I too question myself looking at those mummies, that, oh God, why am I looking at them? They're dead. They didn't want to be seen this way. But another part is that coffins are so beautiful. That whole idea is that the soul comes back to identify who died. That the Egyptians actually were buried in coffins because they wanted to be seen. They knew that there is an afterlife. They wanted to be identified. Maybe not the mummy per se, but at least the coffins. The coffins, they had an intentionality to be seen, but by the soul. So, okay, I went on and on, but I was like on a roll.
So, Dr. Allan, if I may, any other inspiring or inspirational events like Stella that you have come across as a docent?
Well, we talk about nudity, and I think that that's really an interesting topic, because the tours I generally give at the Getty are for school groups. And what I find actually is the opposite of the typical expectation. The younger kids don't care about it. I mean, they notice it. And occasionally there's a youngster that is self-conscious about it. But it really doesn't become an issue until you get to the older kids, the teenagers and the adults. They're the ones that make an issue of it. I think that's an interesting observation.
Yeah.
Okay, any other comments or questions?
I just have another point to make, another question, so to speak. What, in your opinion, stands to be the museum culture today? How do you think it has changed or altered after the pandemic?
Well, I think that one issue that we're all facing is that we've become virtual. And that I think most museums will continue in some form with this virtual format. And it will supplement the live experience. And I think that will be a positive attribute. To be, I don't think the issue is yet settled, because we're not yet out of the pandemic. And whether we will create a new normal or go back to the original normal is still even a question. I know at the Getty, they were closed until about April of this year. They reopened with a soft opening for a limited number of guests, and then now they are open back to their original number of guests, but you still have to make a reservation so that they can control the number of visitors there. And there are effectively no group activities. There are no tours, live tours. So I think it's wait to be seen how those live tours are going to come about if this virus continues to be part of our society.
Is anybody from the Indian context, like how are the museums playing out there? You can think about that. And Mridula, you have a question?
Yes, hi. It was a very engaging talk by Allan, and so does the ongoing discussions are also very thought-provoking. Probably I have a very banal question, but it comes from a very practical problem that we are facing presently in one of our projects. So it is a museum which is situated, it's a state museum which is situated in a historic building. So we are working on conservation of the museum as well as we are also trying to revive certain displays. So we are trying to develop a narrative in which the structure itself, the museum building itself, can also be kind of viewed as an exhibit. So I was just wondering if you would like to share your thoughts, or how can we go about engaging visitors with not only the objects and displays, but also with the building itself.
Well,
If you can also share, if you can let us know, even if Sonali, if she is aware, if there are any resources available, reading material available for this subject.
I think the Vatican, it's like an exhibit itself, like it has history, so many buildings. I'm sure somebody must have written about it. So many buildings in Italy which are like that, right? What do you have to say, Allan?
well, I'm sorry, I'm going to butcher your name, but Mridula? How do you pronounce Mridula? You actually touched upon a point that's close to my heart. And the reason for that is because the design of the J. Paul Getty Museum, the villa itself, is based upon an ancient Roman villa in Naples. And this was selected by J. Paul Getty because he wanted visitors to see the objects in the context of how they would have been when they were created. And so the place, the architecture, and the gardens are as much part of the museum as the objects.
Okay.
And so on my tours, I make that an issue. I make sure that the visitors go outside and we talk about the building, and we talk about the gardens, and we talk about Greek and Roman life. So my answer to you is to simply make that an issue.
Yes, I'll definitely look up for these examples that you and Sonali both suggested, and let's see how it pans out. One of our major issue is that the museum is not situated in a large city. It is in a very small town, and the resources, and especially the people who can engage with visitors, there are very few professionals who are available with that museum. So let's see, we are also trying to figure out how probably the training can be made available for them. One is that we as a designers, we will try to develop a narrative, but later on how that narrative can be taken further by the people who are present on the ground. So yeah, let's see how that pans out.
And Mridula, the other issue is that as you've pointed out, the building itself has a history.
Yes.
So it is an object unto itself.
Yes.
And so that history provides also context. And I think people connect much more to the objects when you talk about the place.
Okay.
And you talk about how these objects got to this place. it makes it real, as opposed to just walking into a building and seeing that an object is there. Well, how did it get there? You know, why is this building here? Who are the people that are involved?
And
You
I
know,
think
that
the
makes it
architecture,
personal.
the architecture itself at the Getty kind of provides a little context to the art that is there, Greek, you know, so the style and the galleries and the herb garden area, it echoes of so many things that remind you of the Greco-Roman world. Isn't that true, Allan?
Absolutely, that was the way it was designed to be.
Even the amphitheater there is, you know, designed that way. And even the cuisine and the cafe.
Yes.
Yeah. And I do want to add, for example, University of California too. The building is inspired by the Abbey Church of, what was the name? San Ambrogio in Milan. So I remember during, when I was a grad student and I was a TA for my medieval Renaissance class. So the professor used to come out and use the buildings at UCLA that are in Romanesque style of architecture and copies of this abbey, and they would like measure and do all of that. So almost making the museum, the architecture, which is almost like, you know, walking in that period. And that's why I find UCL is so inspiring in terms of architecture. It's medieval architecture. And a medieval professor is using that architecture to explain Romanesque architecture. So that becomes even more exciting, interesting, and our ability to kind of connect with the past in such a way. So yeah, and bringing, you know, like, of course, the forum is all about the Himalayas, and we do have talks, you know, from elsewhere just to let us feel inspired. And I'm always of the I'm always of the view that buildings, and for example, in the Himalayas, the traditional Kathkoni architecture, the museum space, like there's this museum which has no soul, so to say. So how to create that soul, how to create that meaning, like objects displayed in the context of how originally it was, because then that allows you to connect with your ancestors, with the past, with the feeling of how things were. Romel has a question. He's raised his hand.
Yeah, Allan, I was just wondering, what are the qualifications of a docent, or what do you consider the most important qualifications?
Well, Roma, I will tell you that the docents come from literally all walks of life. Okay. I was in the business world. I had no formal background in the arts or in history. The single most important qualification is, well, actually, it's a combination of two things. One is the desire to engage and share information with, share your passion for these objects with visitors, and just a love of these objects. I think that's the simple, you know, the idea of sharing. Okay, I think that's the single most important qualification, and that's something that you know, it's really interesting. You know, the J-PAL Getty obviously is a world-class institution, and I had expected that when I first signed up that it would be a very formal place. Okay, and that what we would be required to do is to follow a script, stand up straight, wear a uniform, and salute. And it has been the opposite. And one of the things is that we create a community that's almost like a family. And the reason for that is because our single unifying factor is the desire to share. So we share with the public and we share with ourselves.
So are there any formal training programs available which probably can be recommended to the people who are already involved in visitors engagement?
Well, I can't answer you directly, Mridula. For the Getty, each museum tends to have its own training program. There are definitely degree programs in museum education that exist. In fact, the Getty has a joint program with UCLA on conservation, a master's degree program, which is one of the two. And there are programs in museumship, but not specifically for docents, other than what a museum might give its own docents.
Okay, thank you.
And there are also, the other source, Mridula, is that there are magazines, there are organizations for docents. If you Google docent organizations, you will find them.
Okay, great. Yeah, that would be helpful.
So, Allan, in India, we have two types of museum visitors. So one is the educated school-going children. There is another class of students who are not so privileged, may not have had the benefit of school education, at least not as the ones that the city children go through. If how would you approach communicating with these two sets of children?
Well, in the same way. I mean, the cornerstone of what I think is important is finding a connection, is helping visitors find a personal connection. And so I specifically try to find objects which will help, where the connection can be obvious. Okay, so like for instance, that sarcophagus. Okay, we can all relate to the conflict between Achilles and Hector, and stamping on Hector. So that's a human emotion that is shared. And so this idea of multiculturalism. So I find themes that everybody can connect with and try to relate it to the everyday life. I mean, with the rooms, Greek and Roman ones, we have an incense burner of the goddess of Nike. And when I show them that, I make sure that I wear my Nike hat, and point out their Nike shoes. And we have a lot of objects with Medusa on it. And so I point out that the Medusa is common in many logos. For us, I mean, in India you have Starbucks, right? So we have sirens, a very beautiful siren. So I point out the sirens of these objects, and I say this is what's on Starbucks logos. So I try to get things from their everyday life that connect to it.
And I think all these things like permeate our daily life, in terms of influences. Like if I look at Delhi, for example, even the National Museum with its pillars, and then you look at this area called Connaught Place with its pillars, Greco-Roman influences, Gandharan art, and so many spaces. You start noticing so much more. So museum visits are so important, and what Allan is talking about, bridging that gap through connection, through understanding, like a mere gesture of wearing a Nike hat, it kind of, ignites that interest that, oh my God, it's everywhere around us. And it has a story, and the story can be heard if you go to a museum and you connect and So I think that's such a wonderful way of connecting with the past, that museums should not be boring. They can be made interesting. They can be, they can be made interesting if only we try. If we try not to be bored and not let others get bored too. It's about narrating that story. Yeah, so I think all of us here, we should make an attempt to make a museum and think of ways that even if we are not docents, well, we can be inspired by Allan here and make sure that people who are close to us, who are bored out of their lives, thinking about history, especially during the pandemic, just make them connect. And social media is a good way of kind of, connecting with the past through visual means, inviting people to come to the museum space. And I know that the National Museum has really, in India, the National Museum, how it used to be during my time and how it is now, they're having programs which are engaging. They have the idea of docents now, where people kind of take you around the galleries and interactive panels as well. Yeah.
Rommel, and I sympathize with your question, because part of it is the difficulty we have ourselves, in that when we were brought up, we weren't exposed to an education which created connections. We were just given fact after fact, right? Memorize that multiplication table, as if multiplication wasn't part of our life. Just memorize all this stuff. And so it's hard for us as individuals to get out of that box. And it's hard to find this information because we haven't been thinking that way. But that is the direction that we are going. So, I think the key is that we all need to share the ways in which we're finding this, because it is very difficult.
And I think, Allan, from your talk, I think what all of us take from your talk today is that connect, that filling that connect in an interesting sort of way. And what you just said about, these multiplication tables and all, and that's how we have been raised in India. Learn this, memorize this, but things are now slowly changing. And that's why I said that even the approach of the National Museum in Delhi, I see a change. Youngsters who are, studying, and they are thinking out of the box, that is kind of permeating in the museum space as well. And I see it happening. Okay, Jyotirmay says that speaking of museum buildings, I hear the building is slated to go and the artifacts move to the north and south block. One associates many of the artifacts with the building that was, because that is where you viewed them. Quite disconcerting. Yes, with the Central Vista plan, it's really sad that's happening. For me, I have memories with South Block because my father was in the Ministry of External Affairs. He was a diplomat, and I used to go to South Block as a kid sometimes. And now to know that all these artifacts are going to go there. So also belongingness of the artifacts themselves in the space we've always seen. And with the whole Central Vista plan, which I don't know, Allan is maybe not aware, but with our, politics happening, and there is this new plan, the Central Vista, which kind of takes our museum away from us and places it somewhere totally different. I don't, Jyotirmay, you want to talk about that? How do you feel about?
Well, as I said, I think I'll miss it because I've been there 25 years. So through college and all, and you made multiple visits because that was one of the museums. And, my biggest connection with museums is the National Museum and then the Indian Museum in Calcutta. Those are the two museums I've ever visited in my life. So I would miss it. And suddenly I thought, because people were speaking of buildings and architecture and the artifacts, and I suddenly realized it. And when I think Allan also showed a picture of the National Museum. So when I saw that picture, suddenly I remembered I visited that place so many times. So it's also your own history. A museum visit over time, through university, growing up, a Sunday, you have nothing to do, you go to the museum. It's a great place to be. And there are some artifacts you love watching again and again. So and they have beautiful buildings in their own way, which is itself history. And museums is about it.
It would have been nice that they would have kept the National Museum and made another museum, like that talks about going to the next step. I've taught at the National Museum, and I did, when I was younger, I did my courses there. So I have such beautiful memories of having tea with samosas, during breaks and going around the galleries. So you're so right, Jyotirmay. It takes away so much a part of your own self and your associations with places.
Yeah,
But
because
then,
beyond polarizing politics, I think at the end of the day, for most of us citizens, and I'm saying ordinary citizens, not people who are related to power and who may be making some money out of this move and so many other stuff. Let's not get into politics. I think at the end of the day, I suddenly realized today at this talk, I realized I've often felt badly about it, but I realized what actually irks me, that I'll miss that space because it's so much
yeah.
part of me,
But I think it
my
also
visits over
tells
time.
you, and if this finds comfort, the idea of the impermanence of things, the impermanence,
that's
the Buddhist
that's the
philosophy of impermanence,
that's the Hindu way of thought. Yeah,
yeah, Buddhist too, impermanence.
Buddhist, agree. Fair
It
enough.
speaks
Okay, fair enough.
louder, than words. Like you're looking at materiality that has been left behind by people who don't exist anymore. And then you have this museum that used to think it's your own, and now it's also going to not be there. So the idea of impermanence is there, in everything that we do. Nothing is forever. So
Right.
yeah.
That's a nice way to put it also. True. That's a thought. Okay. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah. Welcome.
So
Yeah.
if I may add, and if we may end on a positive note, am I audible?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. So the government of Manipur, of all the state governments in India, has said that is giving funds to each tribe to have their own museum. It'll be a physical museum, so the money will be used for construction, excuse me, and for a collection of artifacts which describe that particular tribe. I think it's a great endeavor. We will have a museum. I mean, we'll have many museums in the place where they need to be, and not in a centralized, a place far removed from where these artifacts come from. It'll be in the middle of these people, and it'll be a living museum of sorts.
I think that's a great endeavor, and it reminds me of my own advisor, Dr. Willika Vendrick, who made this museum with the Ababdas in the eastern desert of Egypt, using local materials and a little funding. She constructed this little museum for the Ababdas, the original inhabitants of the eastern desert, where they selected what they wanted to showcase, what was important to them, not what was important for the curator, or what the curator thinks is important for the audience, but what they thought was important, what they wanted to convey about themselves. So that is also very important, that what do they think? What do they want to convey? So there's so many strands to it, like what Romel is saying. In Manipur now, the tribes will be able to have their museums and a little funding, so it'll be their viewpoint. And it's also about the juxtaposition of various viewpoints, what we think kind of attracts us. If you look at these early accounts of travelers, British travelers who come to India, what jumps at them versus what jumps at us who are already in that culture is starkly different. So perhaps having a museum space that speaks of these different views of what the audience likes, of what the curator wants the audience to see, what the people of that period want to show, especially living tribes who have that connect with the past. I think it becomes such a beautiful place where you find different viewpoints, and that human spirit that's all around, and learning from that should also be like, there should be like sub galleries of objects as well. Yeah.
No,
So,
you remind
Allan,
me. Oh, excuse me.
Yep.
Well, you remind me of a museum that I went to in what's called the Imperial Valley, which is literally at the border of Mexico. And it's primarily an agricultural community. And they had actually a fairly large museum. It was in a building that actually looked like a warehouse. It probably was a warehouse at one point. But what the way that they created the museum was they literally chopped up the space on the inside and gave the spaces to local organizations. So they even had one space that was for the community from India. They had their space, and they had a space for people from the organization that, for each different kind of organization and different people, and they were responsible for their own space.
I think that's such a great idea. And, we may not be owners of museums. We may or connect with museums, but, we have our homes to, we decorate our homes. Those are our identities, the mantelpiece on the fireplace and shelves. If we have guests who are coming in for the first time, we have this kind of non-verbal engagement about who we really are. What do we want to display? What do you want others to see? And it's a mix of so many ideas of family members. Like, I know I love Tibetan flags, the prayer flags, and my husband forbids me to put them in the living room, so they find place in my study. But I have so many objects that kind of speak of the person I am. Allan, you've been to my place, and sometimes you ask about certain objects, and I have a story to tell. So maybe we should start from our homes. We should start those stories at home so that we sensitize our families and others who visit us to understand that objects are so important. And if they have a story to tell, they have embedded meaning in them. They're just not objects. They're objects that we have bought. They may have been a reason. Maybe it's beauty, maybe it's texture, maybe it's history, who knows? But we should tell that story. And I think that's the first way to connect, and then connect to the museums that speak of our cultures and of cultures around the world. So on that note, I do want to thank Allan for such a wonderful talk, and for allowing this, these thought-provoking conversations today. I want to thank Romel, Mridula, Jyotirmay, and all of those who have, raised questions that make us think. And this is what this forum is all about, that we get together, we talk to people who are in the studies and in this space to make us think, to make us connect. And those of you who are coming here for the first time at the Himalayan Institute of Cultural and Heritage Studies, you can visit us at www.hichs.org. We conduct virtual courses and on-campus courses as well. We have these Sunday talks every Sunday at 7 p.m. Indian Standard Time, 7:30 Indian Standard Time, and 7 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Next week, we are having John Vincent Balaza coming and talking about his studies and engagement with archaeology in Tibet and the Western Himalayas. So all of you are invited for that. Please keep visiting, keep connected through the social media, and connect with Allan. He has given you his email address. Absolutely. And just keep doing what you're doing and raising these questions, because that brings about change. We may not see it, we may not feel it, but it is happening slowly but steadily. So any words of wisdom, Allan? That's our kind of trademark line, that when the speaker departs, he or she has to give their words of wisdom for the audience.
Well, I just want to reiterate what you said, Sonali. I would encourage everybody to keep communicating amongst ourselves and with me. I've given Sonali a reference sheet that I hope she'll distribute to all of you, with which lists, provides a bibliography of some of the material, as well as how to look up some of these images, but it also has my email address. And I would encourage you to stay in touch with me, and through this, we will continue this discussion. And I really, really appreciate being here with you. It's absolutely fascinating. And I really enjoyed this last part as much as all. Thank you very much. Great issues.
Thank you, Allan, and thank you all. And we hope to see you next weekend. And I do want to add, Jyotirmay also conducts wonderful lectures on the Himalayas. Jyotirmay, you should keep connected. I can always kind of forward, so it's really nice to have you all here, investing your time Sunday. And there's a big cricket match going on, as I was told. I think Romel told me that there's a big cricket match. So it's Sonali versus IPL, Himalayan Institute versus, who will win? Of course, cricket will win, everything. So for the ones who are not here, it's okay. I have to upload so many recordings. I have just been so lax, and I will do that in due course. So thank you all. Have a great Sunday evening, and we'll see you next weekend. Bye.
Bye-bye.